Brighton as a place that has kind of various kind of historical moments had a kind of relationship to the kind of carnivalesque. So Brighton was a place that kind of was started off as a royal seaside town, like a lot of the places like Bath. You know, it was kind of somewhere where you go, where the very, very wealthy, the very aristocratic and royalty would go to enjoy leisure, whether that was kind of taken to the waters, it kind of being involved in kind of the latest forms of health benefits. It was also a place that, because of that, because of how it then became popular, all sorts of things kind of took place there as well. And that's an interesting cultural process of how something kind of set up for the very, very kind of wealthy, for the very, the noblest of the people, then becomes something else through popular culture, when popular culture gets its hands on it. So the idea of kind of modesty, the idea of kind of bathing and kind of using kind of bathing huts, so no one could see any kind of flesh. As Brighton became a resort for kind of popular culture, that idea of kind of flesh, excess, sexuality became more and more associated with somewhere like Brighton. So the very wealthy went somewhere else. You know, this is how those kind of cultural forms work. So the very wealthy might then go to Frinton or somewhere very kind of different from Brighton or Southend or somewhere. And one of the things when popular culture becomes kind of very much kind of part of something like beach culture, it becomes kind of it becomes associated with just those kinds of excesses that we kind of see represented around Rabelais or around kind of popular culture. And some of the articles, at least one of the articles, is around Blackpool, a kind of pleasure beach in Lancaster, is it? Who lives in Blackpool? No one lives in Blackpool. Who is here? I mean, people do live in Blackpool. Again, very much kind of associated with excess. And that article is very much about how we can think about those ideas, kind of excess, alongside leisure beaches. So you could almost look at the history of Brighton as it kind of moves through various phases. You know, now it's kind of associated very much with, being the gay capital of the UK. It's also very much associated with being one of the most expensive real estate places in the UK as well. It's not for nothing that it's called London by the Sea, but it's gone through a whole range of kind of situations. When I first came to Brighton in the 70s, it was an absolute, it was like Hastings was about 10 years ago. It was huge amounts of unemployment, huge amounts of kind of dereliction, kind of everywhere. So the whole place has gone through a kind of period of gentrification. So one of the kind of essay questions that you could do at the end of this module is kind of think about the kind of carnivalesque within Brighton and how that works. It was known in the between the wars as a place for illicit sexuality, for somewhere where you go to have a dirty weekend. In fact, the phrase "dirty weekend" became very much associated with Brighton. In the days where you had to get a divorce, for instance, you had to show not that you didn't want to be with that person anymore, but that person had been unfaithful to you, one of the things that people did was they went down to Brighton for the weekend. They would check into a kind of cheap hotel, introduce themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, make sure that the person in checking them in the hotel kind of remembered them in some way, and then they would ask for a maid to come up, and they would be caught in bed together, with the man, with some other person who wasn't his wife. And it would be on that basis that they would be allowed to get divorced, because they'd say, oh, look. So it was a kind of way of getting in divorce without actually having to be unfaithful. So these ideas of kind of low bodily needs, of sexual desire, of food, of kind of festivities, are a kind of way of showing another kind of form of culture, another kind of form of taste, sometimes associated with the working class, but not as a working. The whole image becomes this is people enjoying their bodily excesses rather than kind of about kind of rational, mindful kind of judgments. So this is taste. But it's a shameless taste. You know, this is the kind of key thing. That this wouldn't fit into the kind of Bourdieu idea of culture, because it's actually not playing into that kind of those kind of ideas of hierarchy. It's trying to kind of explode them. And Brighton became known, particularly in the 1960s, as a place for riotous behaviour, that people would come down from London or from Birmingham or wherever, and these would be the mods, the soul boys who worked in offices, who would take kind of amphetamines to listen to soul music all night, who kind of love kind of Italian culture, and there they would fight with the rockers, those people who kind of liked motorbikes rather than scooters, had a kind of sense of masculinity kind of connected to kind of the industrial past, and they would kind of fight on the beaches. So there again we have these kind of moments where the kind of carnivalesque, or the kind of associations with an idea of kind of cultural excess actually kind of erupting into something else, erupting into violence, erupting into something that kind of straight culture or kind of cultural norms can't deal with, can't cope with. It becomes kind of something beyond our norms. Now, you know, Brighton might be a very useful place to kind of think about how those kind of excesses have changed over historical, long historical kind of periods. One of the ways of thinking it might be that there is kind of lots of places, lots of opportunities to have kind of a relationship to the world, to our bodies, that is different from that is kind of promoted as being what is considered to be most tasteful or most meaningful in society. That we can go to these places and dance all night and get off our faces on all sorts of intoxications. That sense of the intoxicated self. And then one of the things we might want to think about, what does it mean when that kind of culture is no longer kind of tied to the calendar? It's no longer tied to the end of harvesting, where we might kind of have an excessive, intoxicated kind of blowout, but where it's more likely to be associated to kind of certain places that we might go to, certain kind of areas of town. So rather than thinking of these things as temporal, they might then become kind of spatial. And we know that there are kind of places where we can go to what's it called where you go to somewhere and you can get like quadruple vodkas. What is a quadruple vodka called? Perhaps I think someone was telling me about, because a lot of kind of the student culture is to encourage people to drink excessively. Am I right? It used to be that you couldn't serve more than a double spirit. You know, it was kind of illegal to do that. And kind of one of the things is that this kind of encouragement to actually kind of make you intoxicated beyond yourself. You know, kind of that would be a kind of cultural aspect of life in Brighton, or in life in kind of lots of kind of student places. So when you're looking at those nightclubs and they're kind of beckoning you in because they're going to sell you, you're going to have like a crazy night, or you're going to go to 18 to 32 holidays where they're just kind of saying, oh my God, you're going to have just such a crazy time. You're going to get so drunk. You're going to have so much sex. You're going to have listen to music all night long, and you're going to vomit, or you're going to, you know, what you're looking at is the kind of carnivalesque. But one of the things we want to think about is this the carnivalesque managed as actually part of culture that's actually quite safe now? It's been reduced where it doesn't actually kind of threaten culture at all. One of the, this is Blackpool. Blackpool has this kind of pleasure beach here, but it also has these kind of carnivalesque aspects to them. Again, you know, this is sometimes literally the world turned upside down. These are kind of spaces and places where we go, and they are excessive. They do things to our bodies that are very different than those kind of values that are kind of associated with it. But again, we might want to think, well, kind of what are the limits of this as kind of critical culture? Tony Bennett, again, kind of in his kind of work on Blackpool Pleasure Beach, he was saying, you know, that actually we're given these kind of moments of kind of vertiginous experience of the body kind of taken to kind of other places. The world is turned upside down, but the whole point of it is then to turn the world back up the right way around. So we have these kind of moments of excess, but they're really there to reinforce the normal. So he writes that the body may be whirled upside down, hurled this way and that by the machinery of the rides, but in the coding of these pleasures for consumption, the dominant symbolic order remains unwaveringly the right way up. So one of the things that I think we could, one of the kind of questions that we can look at across this block is, will symbolic inversion lose its kind of critical potential to disrupt culture if it's just simply commercialized, if it's simply put part of that commercial culture? Or is that argument that commodification manages everything itself a kind of reductive argument, and those symbolic inversions are still kind of important, and they still do work, they still disrupt the kind of the hierarchical order of life. So those are the kind of questions I think will be useful for thinking about this. And it might be that one of the things that we can't do is we can't simply answer these kind of questions theoretically. That it's not enough to say, well, symbolic inversion, as soon as it's commodified, becomes kind of